Picture a village street in the autumn of 1348. Stone cottages line the road, thatch roofs, wooden doors slightly ajar, but no movement, no voices, no footsteps. The silence is absolute. A cart stands abandoned in the middle of the road. Its cargo, bread, now mouldy, spills onto the ground. No one has touched it for days. Inside one cottage, through the open door, you can see a table. 2 bowls of stew, uneaten, now covered in flies. The hearth is cold. In the street a dog wanders, whimpering, searching for its owner. No one comes. This isn't a scene from a horror story. This is Europe in 1348. Real villages, real silence. The Black Death had arrived, and in the span of just 5 years, it would kill between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone alive. 75 to 200 million people dead, the greatest catastrophe in recorded human history. Tonight, we explore that epidemic, how it started, how it spread, and how it changed everything. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's return to the world that plague unmade, the silence of 1348. Before we talk about the disease, let's talk about what it felt like to live through it, because the Black Death wasn't just a medical event, it was an apocalypse. Imagine you're living in a European city, let's say Florence, Italy. The year is 1347. Florence is one of the great cities of the world, wealthy, cultured, beautiful, population about 120,000 people. The streets are crowded, markets bustle, churches ring their bells, workshops hum with activity. Life is hard, yes, medieval life always is, but it's also vibrant, connected, full. Then, in the autumn of 1347, ships arrive from the east. Genoese trading vessels. They've been to Crimea, to Constantinople, to ports along the Black Sea. The sailors are sick. Some are already dead. The ships are ordered to leave. But it's too late. Within weeks, people in Florence start getting ill. It begins with fever, chills, headache, weakness. Then the swellings appear in the groin, under the arms, on the neck, buboes, painful egg-sized lumps, dark, hard, oozing. Some people develop black patches on their skin, necrotic tissue, dead flesh spreading across the body. Hence the name the Black Death. Most who get sick die, and they die quickly. 3 to 5 days from first symptom to death. Some die even faster. They go to bed healthy and never wake up. At first, the city tries to respond. Doctors visit the sick. Families care for their ill. But the disease spreads faster than anyone can comprehend. One person gets sick, then their family, then their neighbors, then everyone on the street. Within months, Florence is overwhelmed. The hospitals are full, then overflowing, then abandoned. There aren't enough doctors. Many have fled. Others are dead. There aren't enough priests. Who will give last rites to the dying? There aren't enough gravediggers. Who will bury the dead? At first, people try to maintain dignity. Proper funerals, prayers, burials in consecrated ground. But soon, there are too many bodies. Mass graves are dug outside the city walls. Huge pits. Bodies are thrown in by the hundreds. Covered with lime. Buried in layers. Still, it's not enough. Bodies pile up in the streets. In homes. In churches. The smell is overwhelming. The city reeks of death and decay. And the living, they're terrified. Some flee, packing whatever they can carry and running to the countryside, hoping distance will save them. It doesn't. The plague follows. It's everywhere. Some lock themselves in their homes, refusing to see anyone, refusing to help even their own family members. Others turn to prayer. Processions of flagellants march through the streets, whipping themselves bloody, begging God for mercy. Some turn to pleasure. If death is inevitable, why not enjoy what time remains? Feasts, wine. Debauchery. Social order collapses. Laws are ignored. Who will enforce them? Markets close. Who will sell? Who will buy? Fields go unplanted. Who will work them? Servants abandon their masters. Children abandon their parents. Spouses abandon each other. The bonds of society, duty, obligation, love dissolve in the face of terror, and the dying continues. By the time the plague burns itself out in Florence, sometime in 1348, the city has lost 60,000 people, half its population, dead in less than a year. And Florence isn't unique. This is happening across Europe. In Siena, Italy, 65,000 dead out of 100,000. In Venice, 100,000 dead out of 150,000. In Paris, half the population gone. In London, 40% dead. In some villages, everyone dies. Entire communities erased. England alone loses nearly half its population, from about 4 million to about 2.5 million. Europe, as a whole, estimates range from 75 million to 200 million dead, out of a total European population of perhaps 75 million. Do the math, that's between 30% and 60% mortality. In some regions, it's worse. Some areas lose 70% or 80% of their people. Imagine that. Imagine 3 out of every 4 people you know dying within a year. Your family, your friends, your neighbours, the shopkeeper, the blacksmith, the priest, the lord of the manor. All gone, and you don't know why. You don't know how it spreads. You don't know how to stop it. You just know that people are dying. Everywhere, all the time. That's what 1348 felt like. That's the silence we're exploring. The contemporaries who lived through it understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian writer, survived the plague in Florence. He wrote, "How many valiant men, how many fair ladies, how many sprightly youths breakfasted in the morning with their kinsfolk, and that same night supped with their ancestors in the other world." A chronicler in Siena wrote, "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through breath and sight. And so they died. None could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship." An English monk recorded, "The plague was so contagious that those touching the dead, or even the sick, were immediately infected and died, so that penitent and confessor were carried together to the grave." These aren't distant statistics. These are eyewitness accounts, people describing the end of the world. And for them, it must have felt exactly like that. The world they knew, stable, ordered, comprehensible, was coming apart. The church, which promised protection and meaning, seemed powerless. Prayers went unanswered. Holy water didn't help. Saints didn't intervene. Good people died just as quickly as bad people. Children died just as quickly as the elderly. The pious died alongside the sinful. There was no pattern, no logic, no mercy, just death, random, relentless, inescapable. Some saw it as divine punishment, God's wrath upon a sinful world. Others saw it as the end times, the apocalypse foretold in Revelation. Many simply saw it as incomprehensible horror, beyond understanding, beyond endurance, and yet life continued, somehow. In the midst of catastrophe, people still woke up, still ate breakfast, still tried to care for the sick. Human resilience is remarkable. Even in the face of unimaginable loss, people adapt, they endure. But the cost was staggering. Entire families wiped out, bloodlines ended, villages abandoned, knowledge lost, craftsmen dead, their skills gone with them, books burned, libraries destroyed, economic collapse, trade disrupted, farms abandoned, famine following plague. social upheaval, labor shortages, rising wages for peasants, revolts, unrest, religious crisis, faith shaken, authority questioned, heresy spreading, cultural trauma that would echo for generations. The Black Death didn't just kill people, it killed the medieval world. The Europe that existed before 1347 was fundamentally different from the Europe that emerged after 1353. The plague was a hinge point in history, a before and after, and to understand it, we need to understand what it was, what caused it, how it worked. So let's turn to the science. Let's meet the organism that brought civilization to its knees. Yersinia pestis, the invincible killer, the Black Death, had a name. We just didn't learn it until the 1890s. Yersinia pestis, a bacterium, tiny, invisible to the naked eye, but devastatingly effective. It's the same organism that causes plague today. Modern plague, still with us. But in the 14th century, no one knew bacteria existed. No one knew about germs, about microorganisms, about disease transmission at the cellular level. They could see the symptoms, the suffering, the death, but the cause, invisible, unknown. Let's start with the basics. What is Yersinia pestis? It's a bacterium, rod-shaped, gram-negative, about 1 to 2 micrometers long. It lives primarily in rodents, rats, marmots, ground squirrels, prairie dogs. It's transmitted by fleas. The oriental rat flea, Xenophila chiopis, is the primary vector. Here's how it works. A flea bites an infected rodent. The bacteria enter the flea's gut. Inside the flea, Y. pestis multiplies rapidly, forming a biofilm that blocks the flea's digestive tract. The flea is now starving. It can't digest blood properly because of the blockage. So it bites frantically, again and again, trying to feed. Each time it bites, it regurgitates bacteria into the wound. If it bites a human, those bacteria enter the bloodstream and the infection begins. Now, Y. pestis has several nasty tricks that make it so effective. First, it can evade the immune system. It has molecules on its surface that prevent white blood cells from recognizing it as foreign. Second, it produces toxins that damage tissue and blood vessels. This causes the characteristic hemorrhaging and necrosis. Third, it spreads rapidly. Once in the bloodstream, it can reach the lymph nodes within hours. The lymph nodes are part of your immune system. They filter pathogens, produce antibodies. But when Y. pestis reaches a lymph node, it doesn't get filtered out. Instead, it multiplies inside the node, exponentially. The node swells, becomes inflamed, fills with bacteria and dead immune cells. This is the bubo, the hallmark of bubonic plague. Painful, hard, hot to the touch. If untreated, the bacteria continue to spread into the bloodstream. This is septicemic plague. The bacteria multiply in the blood, produce toxins, cause blood clotting and hemorrhaging. Fingers and toes turn black from necrosis. Hence, Black Death. Death follows quickly, usually within a week, often within days. But there's another form, even deadlier, pneumonic plague. This happens when the bacteria reach the lungs, either through the bloodstream or through inhalation. Once in the lungs, Y. pestis causes severe pneumonia, coughing, bloody sputum, difficulty breathing. And here's the terrifying part: pneumonic plague is directly contagious. You don't need a flea. You don't need a rat. Just someone coughing near you. Droplets in the air. Inhale them and you're infected. Pneumonic plague kills even faster than bubonic, sometimes within 24 hours of symptoms appearing. And the mortality rate. Without modern antibiotics, bubonic plague kills about 60-90% of those infected. Pneumonic plague, nearly 100%. Even today, with antibiotics, plague is serious, but it's treatable if caught early. In the 14th century, no antibiotics, no understanding of bacteria, no effective treatment, nothing but prayers and hope. So what did medieval doctors try? They tried everything, based on the medical theory of the time. Medieval medicine was based on the ideas of Galen and Hippocrates, ancient Greek physicians. They believed disease was caused by an imbalance in the four humus blood: phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Treatment involved restoring balance, bloodletting, purging, inducing vomiting. None of this helped. In fact, bloodletting probably made things worse by weakening patients. They also believed in miasma theory, bad air, full odors carrying disease, so they tried to combat bad air with good smells, burning incense, carrying flowers, wearing sachets of herbs. Doctors wore strange beaked masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, thinking the smell would protect them. It didn't. Some physicians recommended fleeing the sick. Flee quickly, go far, return slowly. This actually worked, not because of anything they understood, but because distance meant less contact with fleas and infected individuals. Some tried to lance the bibbos, drain the pus. Sometimes this helped slightly by reducing bacterial load, but often it just spread infection. Some used theriac, a supposed cure, all made from dozens of ingredients, including snake flesh and opium. It did nothing for plague. Some turned to prayer, pilgrimages, relics, divine intervention. And when that failed, some blamed scapegoats. Jewish communities were accused of poisoning wells. Thousands were massacred in pogroms across Europe. None of it worked. The plague didn't care about prayers or pogroms or bloodletting. It just kept killing. Now, here's something interesting. We know why. Pestis caused the Black Death because we've sequenced its DNA. In 2011, researchers extracted bacterial DNA from the teeth of Black Death victims buried in London. Teeth preserve DNA well, and why? Pestis circulates in the bloodstream, including the dental pulp. They sequenced the genome, compared it to modern plague strains, and confirmed, yes, this was Yersinia pestis. More specifically, it was a strain ancestral to all modern plague strains, meaning every plague outbreak since the 14th century likely descended from this one. That's how significant the Black Death was. It wasn't just one outbreak. It was the founding event for centuries of plague. And by comparing the ancient DNA to modern strains, scientists could trace the evolution of the bacterium. They found that the Black Death strain was particularly virulent, possibly more deadly than modern strains. Some genetic differences made it better at evading the immune system, better at spreading. Evolution has since made it somewhat less deadly, because, paradoxically, killing your host too quickly isn't always evolutionarily advantageous. If everyone dies before they can spread the disease, the pathogen dies too. But in the 14th century, Y. pestis was at peak lethality, and it found a perfect environment: medieval Europe, crowded cities, poor sanitation, abundant rats, ideal conditions for a flea-borne disease. Add in trade routes connecting the entire known world, and you have a recipe for pandemic. Which brings us to the next question: where did it come from? How did this bacterium, living in Central Asian rodents, end up killing half of Europe? Let's trace the journey. Origins in the East. The Black Death didn't begin in Europe. It began thousands of miles away, in the steppes of Central Asia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, high plateaus, grasslands, home to nomadic tribes and burrowing rodents, marmots specifically, large ground squirrels that live in colonies underground. And in those marmots, Yersinia pestis had lived for thousands of years. An endemic disease, always present, cycling through rodent populations. Sometimes a marmot would die, its fleas would jump to another host. The cycle would continue. Humans occasionally encountered it. Nomadic peoples hunted marmots for meat and fur. Sometimes they got sick. Sometimes they died. But in small, dispersed populations, plague couldn't spread far. It would burn out. Then, in the early 14th century, something changed. We don't know exactly what. Maybe climate fluctuations. Maybe changes in rodent populations. But plague started spreading beyond marmots, into other rodent species, into rats, and rats lived closer to humans, in settlements, in cities. By the 1330s, Chinese sources report unusual mortality. In 1331, one chronicle mentions a plague in Hopei province that killed 90% of the population. Likely an exaggeration, but clearly something devastating was happening. The plague moved along trade routes, the Silk Road. Merchants traveling between east and west, carrying goods, and unknowingly carrying plague. Infected rats stowed away on caravans, fleas hitching a ride. By the early 1340s, plague had reached the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea. A city called Kaffa, modern-day Feodosia, Ukraine. Kaffa was a Genoese trading colony, a bustling port. Merchants from Italy, the Middle East, and Central Asia all converged there. In 1346, the Mongol army besieged Kaffa. The Mongols were suffering from plague. It was killing their soldiers. According to one account, the Mongols catapulted infected corpses over the city walls. The first recorded instance of biological warfare. Whether this story is true or embellished, we don't know. But plague did enter Kaffa, and when the Genoese fled, they took it with them. Ships left Kaffa in 1347, heading for Constantinople, for Italy, for ports across the Mediterranean. The sailors didn't know they were carrying death. But the rats in the hold did their work. One ship arrived in Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. The sailors were sick. Many were dead. The ship was ordered to leave, but it was too late. Plague had come ashore. From Sicily, it spread to mainland Italy, to France, to Spain. By 1348, it was in England. By 1349, in Ireland and Scandinavia. By 1351, in Russia. Within 5 years, it had swept across the entire known world, Europe, North Africa, the Middle East, parts of Asia, millions dead, everywhere. Now, let's pause and consider the scale of that journey, from the steppes of Mongolia to the cities of Europe. Thousands of miles. How did it travel so far, so fast? Trade routes. Specifically, the interconnected network of trade that had developed by the 14th century. The Silk Road connected east and west. Chinese silk, Indian spices, Persian carpets, Italian wool, goods flowed, and with them people, merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, diplomats, and rats. Everywhere humans went, rats followed. Ships were perfect vectors. Enclosed spaces, abundant food stores, rats living in the hold. A ship leaves an infected port. The rats are carrying fleas. The fleas are carrying plague. The voyage takes weeks, months, long enough for the disease to cycle through the rat population. By the time the ship arrives, some rats are dead, some are infected, the fleas are hungry, the ship docks. Rats scurry ashore, or cargo is unloaded, and fleas jump to new hosts. The plague establishes itself in a new port, then spreads inland along roads and rivers. It's a remarkably efficient system for pandemic spread. and the 14th century was the perfect time for it, because the world was more connected than ever before. The Mongol Empire, at its height, controlled much of Asia. The Pax Mongolica, Mongol peace, made trade safer and easier. Cities were growing, populations were dense. Sanitation was poor, climate was changing. The medieval warm period was ending. The Little Ice Age was beginning. Cooler, wetter weather. Crop failures. Famine. Weakened, malnourished populations are more susceptible to disease. Europe, in the 1340s, was primed for catastrophe, and the plague delivered. But here's something fascinating. This wasn't the first time. The plague of Justinian in the 6th century CE was also caused by Yersinia pestis. It killed millions across the Byzantine Empire, and genetic analysis suggests it came from the same Central Asian reservoir. Plague seems to emerge from Central Asia periodically, perhaps every few centuries. Environmental changes trigger an outbreak in rodent populations. The disease spills over into humans. If conditions are right, if trade networks connect populations, if cities are dense enough, it becomes a pandemic. The Black Death was the second plague pandemic. The third would come later, in the 19th and 20th centuries. Starting in China in the 1850s, spreading globally. That's when scientists finally identified the bacterium, finally understood the mechanism. But in 1347, all of that was unknown. People saw the plague spreading, city to city, port to port. But they didn't understand why. Some blamed the stars, a conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in 1345, astrological calamity. Some blamed earthquakes, releasing poisonous vapors from the earth. Some blamed sin, moral decay bringing divine punishment. Some blamed minorities, Jews, lepers, foreigners, anyone who could be scapegoated. None of these explanations were correct, but they reflect the desperate need to understand, to make sense of the senseless, to find meaning in the apocalypse, and in a way, the question, why, is as important as the question, how, because the Black Death wasn't just a biological event, it was a civilizational trauma. It shattered the medieval worldview, the belief that God protected the faithful, that the church mediated salvation, that the world was ordered and comprehensible. All of that died with the millions, and what emerged afterward was a different world, a world that would question authority, challenge tradition, seek new answers. The Black Death killed the Middle Ages, and in doing so, it helped birth the Renaissance. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, we need to understand what happened during the plague, how people experienced it, how they tried to survive. The Sage of Kaffa plague comes to Europe, PHECAGE off Keffafe, PAGU Comestio Europe. Let's return to Kaffa, the Crimean port, 1346, because this is where the Black Death's journey to Europe truly begins. Kaffa was a remarkable place, a cosmopolitan city on the edge of empires, controlled by Genoa, one of Italy's great maritime republics, but surrounded by Mongol territory. The city was wealthy, built on trade. Goods from the east passed through Kaffa on their way to Europe. Silk, spices, gems, slaves. Yes, slaves. Kaffa was a major slave trading hub. Mostly captives from the Caucasus and Central Asia, sold to markets in Egypt and the Mediterranean. The city was heavily fortified. Massive walls, towers, a deep harbour. Inside, a mix of cultures, Genoese merchants, Greek Orthodox Christians, Armenians, Jews, Muslims, languages blending, coins changing hands, ships arriving and departing daily. But in 1346, the Mongol Khan of the Golden Horde, Janibeg, decided Kaffa was a problem. Trade disputes, political tensions, the usual complications of medieval geopolitics. He laid siege to the city. His army surrounded it, cut it off from the land, but Kaffa was supplied by sea. Genoese ships could still come and go. The siege dragged on. Then plague arrived in the Mongol camp. Soldiers started dying, not from battle, from disease, high fevers, buboes, black skin, death within days. The Mongols were panicking. Their army was melting away. And according to the chronicler Gebrildi Mussi, a Genoese notary who may have witnessed events, the Mongols did something extraordinary. They used catapults to hurl the corpses of plague victims over Kaffa's walls. D. Mussi wrote, the Tartars, fatigued by such a plague and pestiferous disease, stupefied and amazed, observing themselves dying without hope of health, ordered cadavers placed on their catapults and lobbed into the city of Kaffa, so that by means of these intolerable passengers the defenders died widely. Thus were mountains of dead thrown into the city. Mountains of dead. Imagine that. You're inside the city walls, defending against a siege, and corpses start raining down from the sky. Rotting, disease-ridden, landing in streets, in courtyards, in homes. The psychological impact alone would be devastating. But was it effective as biological warfare? Probably not in the way the Mongols intended. Handling plague corpses is dangerous, but the primary mode of transmission isn't direct contact with dead bodies. It's the fleas. When a human dies of plague, the fleas feeding on them lose their host. They jump to new hosts, the living. So catapulting corpses might have brought fleas into the city, but so would many other routes. More likely, plague entered Kaffa through rats. Rodents crossing the siege lines, infesting the city's grain stores, or through infected people. Deserters from the Mongol camp, refugees. Traders who slipped through. However it arrived, plague took hold in Kaffa. D. Mussi continues. The dying Tartars, stunned and stupefied by the immensity of the disaster brought about by the disease, and realizing that they had no hope of escape, lost interest in the siege. But behold, the whole army was affected by a disease which overran the Tartars and killed thousands upon thousands every day. And so the Tartars, nearly totally destroyed, weakened in the face of death, began to withdraw in haste. The siege ended, not because Kaffa won, but because the besiegers were dying faster than the besieged. The Mongols retreated. The city was saved. But the plague remained. Inside Kaffa, people were dying, the streets filled with bodies. Panic spread, and the Genoese made a fateful decision: flee. In the autumn of 1347, Genoese ships left Kaffa, heading home to Italy, to Constantinople, to ports across the Mediterranean. They were trying to escape death. Instead, they carried it with them. One fleet reached Messina, Sicily, in October 1347. The Sicilian authorities, seeing the sick sailors, ordered the ships to leave immediately. But it was too late. Plague had come ashore. Within days, people in Messina were dying. Within weeks, the city was in chaos. Another fleet reached Genoa. Same story. Sick sailors. Plague spreading. Another reached Marseille, France. Again plague. Constantinople, the great capital of the Byzantine Empire, was hit especially hard. The emperor's son, Andronikos, died of plague in 1347. The Byzantine historian Nikephoros Gregoras described it. The calamity did not destroy men only, but many animals living with and domesticated by men. I speak of dogs and horses, and all the species of birds, even the rats that happen to live within the walls of the houses. Animals dying. Rats, dogs, horses. a plague that killed indiscriminately. By 1348, Constantinople had lost perhaps 1/3 of its population. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by centuries of conflict, never fully recovered. A century later, in 1453, it would fall to the Ottomans. The Black Death didn't directly cause that fall, but it was a wound the empire couldn't heal. Back in Europe, the plague spread inland from the ports. From Messina, it moved to the Italian mainland, to Genoa, to Pisa, to Florence, to Venice. From Marseille, it spread through France, up the Rhône Valley, to Paris, to the Atlantic coast. From there, ships carried it to England, to Spain, to Portugal. Everywhere it went, the same pattern: arrival, denial, panic, death, collapse. Cities tried to protect themselves. Venice, in particular, pioneered public health measures. In 1348, Venice appointed 3 officials specifically to deal with plague: the Provveditori alla Sanit, providers of health. They ordered the isolation of incoming ships. Sailors had to wait before disembarking. At first, the waiting period was 30 days. Trentina? Later, it was extended to 40 days. Quarantina, from which we get the word quarantine. It was a revolutionary idea. That disease could be controlled through isolation, through public policy, and it worked. Partially. Quarantine couldn't stop the plague entirely, but it slowed transmission, saved some lives. Other cities adopted similar measures, isolating the sick, closing markets, banning gatherings, but the scale of the outbreak overwhelmed every response. There simply weren't enough resources, enough people, enough knowledge, and the plague was relentless. It moved faster than medieval communication. By the time a city heard plague was coming, it was often already there. Merchants fleeing infected cities brought it to new ones. Armies on the march spread it across battlefields and countryside. Pilgrims travelling to holy sites carried it from shrine to shrine. The very fabric of medieval life, movement, trade, pilgrimage, war facilitated the spread. And there was no escape. The rich fled to their country estates. The plague followed. The poor stayed in cities, too weak or poor to leave. The plague consumed them. Monks isolated themselves in monasteries. The plague entered anyway. Some villages tried to seal themselves off, barring travellers, cutting all contact with the outside world. A few succeeded, isolated enough, remote enough, lucky enough to avoid infection. But most didn't. The plague moved like a wave, unstoppable, inexorable. From 1347 to 1353, it swept across the known world. By the time it finished its first pass, Europe was transformed. 1/3 to 1/2 of the population gone. Cities depopulated, villages abandoned, fields overgrown, an entire generation erased. And those who survived carried the memory, the trauma, because even when the dying slowed, life didn't simply return to normal. How could it? How do you rebuild when half your neighbours are dead? When your family is gone? When every certainty has been shattered? The plague left survivors in a world they barely recognised. And we need to understand what that world looked like, what daily life was like during the plague, how people tried to survive, to endure. So let's step into that world. The wave across Europe, the plague didn't hit everywhere at once. It moved in waves. And if you trace its path, you can see the routes of medieval trade and travel written in death. Let's follow the wave. Year by year, city by city, 1347, the Mediterranean, Messina, Sicily. October, the first Italian city hit. Panic. Half the population flees. The plague goes with them. Constantinople. By November, the death toll is catastrophic. The emperor's court is in mourning. The patriarch himself falls ill, but survives. Genoa, December. The disease spreads through the crowded port. Bodies pile in the streets. By the end of 1347, the eastern Mediterranean is engulfed. 1348, Italy and France, January. Venice. The great maritime republic, wealth, power, beauty. Plague enters through the port, spreads through the canals. The city's population drops from 120,000 to 60,000 in months. The Palazzo Ducale becomes a morgue. The Grand Council loses member after member. February, Florence. We've already visited this city. By summer, 60,000 dead out of 100 Zalosen. Boccaccio, who survived, will later write the Decameron, a collection of stories told by 10 young people fleeing the plague. Fiction born from apocalypse. March, Pisa, Siena, Padua, Milan. Northern Italy is burning with plague. In Siena, the chronicler Agnolo di Tura writes, "Father abandoned child, wife husband, one brother another, for this illness seemed to strike through the breath and sight. And so they died, and none could be found to bury the dead for money or friendship. And I, Agnolo di Tura, called the Fat, buried my 5 children with my own hands." 5 children buried by their father, his own hands. By spring, the plague crosses the Alps. April, Marseille, the great French port. Plague spreads inland, up the Rhône. May, Avignon, seat of the papacy. Pope Clement VI is in residence. The papal city is crowded. Thousands of clergy, pilgrims, merchants. Plague spreads rapidly. The death toll is staggering. Guy de Chauliac, the Pope's physician, describes, "It was so contagious that it was transmitted from one person to another even by sight. No one could be found who would bury the dead, even for money. The Pope himself isolates, sits between 2 large fires meant to purify the air. He survives, but 11,000 die in Avignon, a quarter of the population. June, Paris, the largest city in Europe, 200,000 people. The plague enters from the south, spreads through the crowded neighborhoods, the narrow streets. By August, 50,000 are dead. By the end of the year, 100,000. Half the city, gone. The University of Paris loses most of its faculty. Entire colleges close. Knowledge is lost. Summer. The plague spreads to Spain, to Aragon, to Catalonia, to Castile, Barcelona, Valencia, Seville. King Alfonso XI of Castile dies of plague in March 1350 while besieging Gibraltar. A king, dead of the same disease killing peasants. The plague does not discriminate. August, the plague crosses the Channel. England, a ship from Calais docks at Melcombe Regis in Dorset. Plague comes ashore. By autumn, it's in Bristol. Then London. 1349, England, Germany, Scandinavia, January, London, the great city, England's heart, population 60,000 to 70,000, by the end of the year 40,000. King Edward III moves his court to the countryside. Parliament is suspended. The Archbishop of Canterbury dies. His replacement dies a few months later. The next one also dies. 3 archbishops in 1 year. The monasteries are hit hard. Close quarters, shared meals, communal living, perfect conditions for plague. Westminster Abbey loses half its monks. Spring. The plague spreads north. York, Durham, Newcastle. Summer. Scotland. The Scots had been raiding northern England. Seeing the English weakness, they gathered an army. Then plague hit the Scottish army. Thousands died. The survivors fled north, carrying plague with them. Edinburgh, Glasgow, Aberdeen, all hit. Summer. Norway. A ship arrives. Ghost ship. The crew is dead. But the rats are alive. Bergen, Trondheim. The plague spreads along the coast. King Magnus of Norway loses his wife and youngest son. Autumn. Sweden, Denmark, The plague follows trade routes: Copenhagen, Stockholm, entire villages depopulated. Winter, Germany. The Low Countries, Cologne, Mainz, Hamburg, Lübeck. The Hanseatic League, the great trading confederation of Northern Europe, is devastated. Trade collapses. Ships sit idle. Markets empty. And in Germany, something terrible happens. The flagellant movement grows. Processions of men whipping themselves, begging God for mercy. And they need someone to blame: Jews. Accusations spread. Jews are poisoning wells. Causing the plague. It's absurd. Jews are dying of plague just like Christians. But logic doesn't matter to mobs. Pogroms begin. In Strasbourg, February 1349, 2,000 Jews are burned alive, accused of well poisoning. In Mainz, 6,000 Jews killed. In Cologne, in Frankfurt, in Basel. Across the Rhineland, Jewish communities are massacred. Pope Clement VI issues a bull condemning the violence, pointing out that Jews are dying of plague too, that the accusations are false. It doesn't stop the massacres. By the end of 1349, Jewish communities across Europe have been decimated. Some flee east, to Poland, to Lithuania, where rulers offer protection. The Jewish communities of Eastern Europe have their roots in these desperate migrations. Tragedy upon tragedy. 1350-1353, the periphery, the plague continues, spreading to the edges of Europe. Poland, Hungary, the Balkans, Russia, the Grand Duchy of Moscow. Plague spreads along the Volga, the farthest reaches. Finland, the Baltic states. By 1353, the first wave is largely over. The plague has swept across the entire known world, from Sicily to Scotland, from Portugal to Russia. Every major city, every region, every kingdom. The map of plague spread is also a map of medieval connectivity. You can trace trade routes in the pattern of death. The Silk Road, the Mediterranean sea lanes, the Hanseatic trade network, the pilgrimage roads, all became vectors, all became highways for plague, and the death toll we'll never know exactly. Record keeping collapsed during the plague. Many documents were lost. Many deaths went unrecorded, but estimates suggest 75 million to 200 million dead worldwide. In Europe alone, 30 million to 50 million. Out of a population of 75 million to 80 million, 40% to 60% mortality. Some regions were hit harder than others. Tuscany, perhaps 70% mortality. Catalonia, 60-65%. England, 40-50%. Some isolated areas escaped. Small villages, mountain communities, remote islands. But most places experienced catastrophic loss. Entire villages abandoned, fields returned to wilderness, churches empty. England alone lost nearly 1,000 villages, simply erased. The landscape changed, physically, demographically. Aerial photography today can still reveal lost villages, faint marks in fields where medieval settlements once stood. Ghosts in the landscape. By 1353, the acute phase was over. The wave had passed, but the plague didn't disappear. It came back again and again. Second pandemic, 1363. Third pandemic, 1369-1371. Fourth, fifth, sixth. For the next 300 years, plague would return every generation. Never as deadly as the first outbreak, but deadly enough. A constant threat, a recurring nightmare. Not until the 18th century would Europe finally be free of regular plague outbreaks. And in some places, plague never left at all. It remains endemic in rodent populations in parts of Central Asia, in Madagascar, in parts of the American West. Even today, there are a few thousand cases of plague globally each year, treatable with antibiotics, but still dangerous if untreated. The same bacterium, the same disease, still with us. But in the 14th century, there was no treatment, no understanding, no escape. just the daily experience of living through apocalypse. And that's what we need to explore next, not the statistics, not the maps, not the spread, but the experience. What was it actually like to live through the Black Death? Life during the plague. Imagine you wake up in Florence. Spring 1348. The plague has been in the city for 2 months. You've survived so far. You step outside. The street is quieter than it should be. Shops are closed. Shutters drawn. Only a few people moving, hurrying, avoiding eye contact. You smell it before you see it. The smell of death, sweet, rotten, inescapable. A cart rumbles past, the plague cart, piled with bodies. A man rings a bell. Bring out your dead. A door opens. A woman, weeping, helps drag a body into the street. Her husband, maybe. Her father. The cart moves on. The body is thrown in with the others. No ceremony. No prayers. Just disposal. You walk to the market, hoping for bread. Half the stalls are empty. The merchants who remain charge outrageous prices. They know you're desperate, you pay. What choice do you have? On the way home, you pass a church. The door is open. Inside, you hear sobbing. A priest is conducting a mass funeral. Dozens of bodies wrapped in cloth, all buried together. The priest himself looks ill, pale, sweating. He stumbles over the Latin. How long until he's one of the bodies? Back home, you check on your family. Your wife is preparing a meager dinner. Your daughter is helping. Your son is in the corner quiet, too quiet. You call to him. He doesn't respond. You walk over, touch his forehead, burning. Your heart stops. He looks up at you. Papa, I don't feel well. You examine him. No bubbos. Not yet. Maybe it's just a fever. Maybe it's nothing. But in your gut, you've seen this too many times. The fever comes first. Then the swellings. Then death. Your wife sees your face. She understands. She collapses, sobbing. What do? Do you call a doctor? The few who remain charge fortunes, and they can't help anyway. Do you call a priest for last rites? But exposing him to plague might kill him too. Do you isolate your son, keep him away from your daughter? But how? You live in 2 rooms. Do you flee, take the rest of your family and run? But where? The countryside is infected too. And you're not wealthy. You have nowhere to go. So you stay. You try to keep him comfortable. You pray. That night, the buboes appear. Under his arm, in his groin. He screams in pain. The swellings are agonizing. You try to soothe him. Cool cloths. Water. Gentle words. Your wife can't bear to look. She's in the other room. Praying. Clutching a rosary. Your daughter is terrified. She's never seen anything like this. By the second night, your son is delirious, fevered. Speaking nonsense. Black patches appear on his skin. Necrosis spreading. By the third morning, he's dead. He was 8 years old. You wrap him in a sheet. The best you can do. You carry him into the street. Wait for the plague cart. When it comes, you hand him over. The man with the bell barely looks at you. He's done this hundreds of times. Your son's body is thrown in with the others. Strangers, all going to the same mass grave. You return home, numb. Your wife hasn't stopped weeping. Your daughter is sitting in the corner, exactly where your son was 3 days ago. Papa, she says, I have a headache. This is life during the plague, not statistics, not historical analysis, this. Daily. Unrelenting. Terror. The knowledge that anyone could sicken at any moment. That most who sicken will die. That there's nothing you can do. The plague wasn't a single event. It was a sustained catastrophe. Months of death. And it broke people. Some broke toward faith. Desperate, fervent prayer, processions, pilgrimages, offerings to saints. In Germany, the flagellant movement grew. Hundreds of men, sometimes thousands, marching from town to town, whipping themselves with leather straps studded with iron, blood running down their backs, singing hymns, begging God for forgiveness. They believed their suffering would appease divine wrath, would end the plague. It didn't. Eventually, the church condemned the movement. Too much fervour, too much autonomy, too much threat to clerical authority. But for a time, the flagellants embodied the desperation of an age. Others broke toward pleasure. If death was inevitable, why not enjoy what time remained? Boccaccio describes this in the Decameron. Others maintained free, living to be a better preservative, and would balk no passion or appetite they wished to gratify, drinking and revelling incessantly from tavern to tavern, and doing what most pleased them. This they could easily do, because everyone felt doomed and had abandoned his property, so that most houses became common property and strangers would make use of them at will. Abandoned houses, abandoned property, abandoned morals. Why plan for tomorrow when tomorrow might not come? Some people locked themselves away, refused all contact, tried to wait it out in isolation. Boccaccio again. Some persons thought that moderate living and the avoidance of all superfluity would preserve them from the epidemic. They formed small communities, living entirely separate from everybody else. They shut themselves up in houses where there were no sick, eating the finest food and drinking the best wine very temperately. Did it work? Sometimes. Isolation, if strict enough, could protect. But most people couldn't afford such isolation. They had to work, to buy food, to interact, and one exposure was often enough. The medical response was nearly useless. Doctors tried everything, based on flawed theory but genuine desperation. Bloodletting, purging, lancing buboes, theriac vinegar, aromatic herbs. Some doctors wore the famous plague doctor costume, though this became more common in later outbreaks. Long beak, shaped mask filled with herbs and spices, meant to filter bad air. Long leather coat, gloves, a cane to examine patients without touching. It's an iconic image, but largely ineffective. Plague is bacterial, airborne in pneumonic form, flea-borne in bubonic form. Smelling roses doesn't help, and many doctors fled. Who could blame them? Those who stayed often died. Exposure, day after day. Guy de Chauliac, the Pope's physician in Avignon, wrote, "The sickness was shameful for the physicians, who could give no help, especially as, out of fear of infection, they hesitated to visit the sick. When they did visit them, they did hardly anything for them, and were paid nothing, for all the sick died, except some few at the last who escaped, the buboes being ripened. Physicians hesitated, and who can judge them? They had families too. Lives. They knew treating plague patients was likely a death sentence. Some stayed anyway, out of duty, out of courage, and died. Priests faced the same dilemma. The dying needed last rites, confession, absolution. But giving last rites meant close contact, touching, breathing the same air. Many priests fled, abandoned their parishes. Others stayed and died. In England, perhaps 40-45% of clergy died during the Black Death. Monks, nuns, priests, bishops, entire monasteries wiped out. After the plague, there was a shortage of trained clergy. The church had to ordain less educated men, lower standards. This contributed to later criticisms of clerical corruption and ignorance. The seeds of the Reformation, some argue, were planted in the plague years. But in 1348, people still turned to the church, because what else was there? Civic authority also collapsed. Governments tried to respond, but most measures failed. Quarantine helped, but wasn't strictly enforced. Cleaning streets, burying the dead properly, banning public gatherings, all useful, but insufficient. The scale was too vast, the resources too limited, and the science was wrong. Miasma theory didn't identify the real vectors, fleas, rats, so measures focused on air, on smell, on cleanliness, which helped somewhat, but didn't stop plague. Social order frayed, laws were ignored. Who would enforce them? The constables were dead or fled. Crime increased. Looting. Theft. Why not steal? The owners are dead. You might be dead tomorrow. Some people abandoned their families. Boccaccio describes, "This scourge had implanted so great a terror in the hearts of men and women that brother abandoned brother, uncles their nephews, sisters their brothers, and very often wives their husbands. Even more extraordinary, fathers and mothers refused to see and tend their children as if they were not their own." Not everyone, of course. Many stayed. Many cared for the sick despite the risk. Acts of extraordinary courage and love, but enough people fled. Enough abandoned their responsibilities. That social bonds weakened. Trust eroded. The plague taught people that they were alone, that institutions couldn't save them, that even family might abandon you. It was a brutal lesson, and it reshaped society. After the plague, there was less deference, less acceptance of authority. Why obey lords and priests who couldn't protect you? Why accept your place in the social order when death made everyone equal? Plague, paradoxically, was a leveller. Rich and poor, noble and peasant, clergy and laity, all died the same. Yes, the rich could flee to country estates, had better nutrition, better housing, but plague still found them. Kings died, bishops died, nobles died, and that shattered the medieval assumption that social hierarchy reflected divine order. If God let princes die like paupers, what did that say about the hierarchy? These questions would echo for centuries, but in the moment, people were just trying to survive, day by day, hour by hour, hoping they'd wake up healthy, hoping their loved ones would too, living with constant grief, constant fear. Can you imagine that? Months of it. The psychological toll must have been immense, and we see evidence of it in art, in literature, in cultural shifts. The dance macabre, the dance of death, a motif that emerges after the Black Death. Skeletons dancing with the living, leading them to the grave, king and pauper, priest and merchant, all dancing with death. A memento mori. Remember, you will die. Plague survivors knew this viscerally. They'd seen it, over and over. Death was no longer abstract, no longer distant. It was immediate, present, inescapable. And that changed how they saw the world. The social earthquake, the plague killed people. But it also killed the medieval social order. Not immediately. Not all at once. But the foundations cracked, and over the following decades, the structure collapsed. Let's start with the most basic economic fact: labor. Before the plague, Europe was crowded, perhaps 75 million people. Land was scarce. Labor was abundant. If you were a peasant, you had little bargaining power. Lots of people needed work, not enough land to go around. Lords could pay low wages, demand high rents, impose strict conditions, and if you didn't like it, someone else would take your place. This was the feudal system, a hierarchy of obligations. Lords owned land, peasants worked it, peasants owed labour service, days of work on the Lord's fields, rent in kind, a portion of their harvest. In return, the Lord provided protection, justice, order. It was exploitative, no question. But it was stable. It had lasted centuries. Then half the population died. Suddenly, labor was scarce, land was abundant. The whole economic equation reversed. Imagine you're a lord, you own a manor, hundreds of acres. Before the plague, you had 50 peasant families working your land. Now you have 20. Your fields need plowing, planting, harvesting, but you don't have enough workers. You can try to force the remaining peasants to work harder, demand more labor service. But they know their value now. They know you're desperate. They can negotiate, or they can leave, because the manor next door also needs workers, and they're offering better terms, higher wages, lower rents, less labor service. What do? You match the offer. You have no choice. Wages rise dramatically. In England, pre-plague, a labourer might earn 2 pence a day. By 1350, it's 4 pence. By 1360, 6 pence. Wages tripled. Rents fall. Land is cheap because there's no one to work it. Peasants who were tied to the land, bound by feudal obligations, suddenly have options. Mobility, freedom. This terrified the ruling class. In England, the Statute of Labourers was passed in 1351. It tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, made it illegal for workers to demand higher pay. It failed. You can't legislate against market forces. Labour was scarce. Wages had to rise. Peasants simply ignored the law, or moved to places that didn't enforce it. Similar laws were passed across Europe. France, Spain, Italy. All failed. The economic reality was undeniable. Workers had leverage, and they used it. But it wasn't just economics. It was psychology. The plague had shown peasants that their lords were mortal, vulnerable. Nobles died just like commoners. The social hierarchy didn't protect anyone. So why should peasants accept their inferior status? Why should they bow to lords who couldn't even protect them from disease? These questions simmered, and eventually they exploded. In 1358, France experienced the Jacquerie, a massive peasant revolt. Thousands of peasants rose up, attacked nobles, burned castles. It was brutally suppressed. But it was a sign. The old order was cracking. In 1381, England experienced the Peasants' Revolt, triggered by a poll tax, but fueled by decades of frustration. Led by Wat Tyler and John Ball, a radical priest, Ball preached, "When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman?" Meaning, in the beginning, everyone was equal. Social hierarchy is artificial, man-made, heretical idea. Dangerous idea, but it resonated. Tens of thousands of peasants marched on London, demanded the end of serfdom, the abolition of feudal obligations. They occupied the city, executed officials, burned records of debts and obligations. The young king, Richard II, met with them, promised reforms. Then, once the rebels dispersed, the promises were broken. The leaders were executed, but the revolt left a mark. Serfdom didn't end immediately, but it was weakened. Over the next century, feudal obligations gradually dissolved. Peasants became tenant farmers, paying rent in cash, not labour. Some became independent landowners, yeomen, a middle class emerging. Social mobility increased. Before the plague, your status was fixed. Born a peasant, die a peasant. After the plague, there were opportunities. A clever peasant could acquire land, become prosperous. A skilled craftsman could open a workshop, grow wealthy. There were fewer people, but also fewer competitors. If you survived, if you were ambitious, you could rise. This wasn't universal. many remained trapped in poverty, but the possibility existed in a way it hadn't before. The plague also changed gender dynamics. With so many men dead, women took on roles they'd been excluded from. Women inherited property, ran businesses, worked trades. In some guilds, widows were allowed to continue their husband's work, become master craftswomen. This didn't mean equality. Medieval society remained deeply patriarchal, but it opened spaces, created precedents, and it showed that women were capable of far more than society had allowed. The economic consequences rippled outward. With fewer workers, labour-saving technologies became valuable. Water mills, windmills, mechanical improvements, agricultural practices changed. Less intensive cultivation, more focus on livestock, because you can't grow grain without lots of labourers, but you can raise sheep with a few shepherds. England shifted toward wool production, the great wool trade that would define the later medieval economy. Trade routes shifted. Some cities declined, others rose. The Hanseatic League, the Northern European trading network, was devastated, never fully recovered. Italian city-states, especially Florence and Venice, adapted better. Their economies diversified. Banking, manufacturing, art. The Medici family rose to power in Florence in the 15th century, built their fortune on banking. Would that have been possible without the plague reshuffling the economic deck? Maybe. But the plague created opportunities for new wealth, new power. It broke old monopolies, old families, old structures. And in the chaos, the clever and ruthless could thrive. The Black Death was, in a perverse way, economically beneficial for survivors. Higher wages, lower rents, more opportunities. If you lived, you could prosper. But that's a cold comfort when you've lost your entire family, when your neighbours are dead, your friends, your children. Prosperity built on mass graves. Still, the economic transformation was real. The late 14th and 15th centuries saw rising living standards for many, better diets, more meat, better clothing, better housing. The golden age of the labourer, some historians call it. Wages high, prices low. It didn't last. Population recovered. By the 16th century, wages were falling again. But for a century, ordinary people experienced something rare economic improvement. And they remembered it. When later generations faced oppression, they looked back. Things were better after the plague. A strange nostalgia, but understandable, because the plague, for all its horror, broke the chains. It showed that the social order wasn't fixed, wasn't divinely ordained. It could change. It could be challenged. That lesson would echo through revolutions to come. But economic change wasn't the only upheaval. The plague also shook the foundations of faith. And that crisis was even deeper. The religious crisis. The medieval world was fundamentally religious. Everything, life, death, society, nature, was understood through the lens of Christianity. The church was the ultimate authority. It mediated salvation. It explained suffering. It provided meaning. And when the plague came, people turned to the church. They prayed, they confessed, they sought absolution. They funded masses for the dead, donated to monasteries, made pilgrimages. Surely God would hear. Surely the church could intercede. But the plague continued. Prayers went unanswered. Saints' relics provided no protection. Masses didn't stop the dying. Good Christians died. Bad Christians died. Clergy died. The righteous and the wicked, indiscriminately. Where was God? Why wasn't he listening? These questions shook medieval faith to its core. The church had answers, of course, The plague was divine punishment. Humanity's sins had provoked God's wrath. Repent, pray more, give more to the church. But this explanation only went so far. If the plague was punishment, why did it kill everyone? The pious and the sinful alike. Why did children die? Infants who had committed no sin. Why did clergy die? Men and women dedicated to God's service. The theodicy, the justification of God's goodness in the face of evil, didn't hold up, and people noticed. Some doubled down on faith. If God was angry, they'd pray harder, suffer more, hence the flagellants, whipping themselves bloody, performing public penance. They believed their suffering could appease God. The movement spread across Europe. Thousands joined. But the church viewed them with suspicion. The flagellants operated outside ecclesiastical authority. They didn't need priests, didn't need the church's mediation. They went directly to God. That was dangerous. It undermined the church's role. In 1349, Pope Clement VIII condemned the movement, called it heretical. Many flagellants were arrested, executed, but the impulse behind the movement persisted: direct access to God, without clerical intermediaries. This was a seed. It would grow into later reform movements, the Lollards, the Hussites, eventually the Protestant Reformation. The plague didn't cause the Reformation, but it weakened the structures that had held Christendom together. It raised questions the church couldn't adequately answer. The clergy's reputation suffered. Many priests had fled during the plague, abandoned their parishes. The faithful remembered. Many clergy had died. The church had to replace them quickly. Standards dropped. Less education, less training. The post-plague clergy were often less respected, less knowledgeable. Complaints about clerical ignorance and corruption increased, and the church's wealth became a source of resentment. The church had grown rich from donations, from plague victims leaving their estates to monasteries. Masses for the dead were profitable. Chantries, chapels dedicated to praying for the dead, proliferated, all funded by terrified families hoping to speed loved ones through purgatory. The church prospered while everyone else suffered. That didn't sit well. Critics, like John Wycliffe in England, began questioning the church's wealth, its authority, its doctrines. Wycliffe argued that the Bible, not the church, was the ultimate authority. That salvation came through faith, not through ecclesiastical rituals. That the church should be poor like the apostles. Heretical ideas, dangerous ideas. Wycliffe was condemned, but his ideas spread. The Lollard movement in England, the Hussite movement in Bohemia, seeds of dissent. The plague also changed religious practice, obsession with death, with the afterlife, with judgment. Art became darker, more focused on mortality. The memento mori, remember you will die. Skulls, skeletons, rotting corpses. The dance macabre, death dancing with the living. The transi-tomb, a tomb showing the deceased both as they were in life and as a decaying corpse. A reminder, no matter how powerful, how beautiful, you become worm food. Grim, but honest. The plague generation had seen too much death to romanticize it. Piety became more personal, more emotional. The rise of mysticism, direct personal experience of God. Julian of Norwich, an English mystic, experienced visions during a near-fatal illness in 1373. She wrote revelations of divine love, emphasizing God's love and mercy. All shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well. A message of hope in a time of despair. Mysticism offered what the institutional church couldn't: a personal connection, emotional comfort. The devotio moderna, the modern devotion, emerged in the Low Countries, a movement emphasizing personal piety, reading, meditation, inner spirituality, less focus on ritual, more on individual relationship with God. Again, a shift away from clerical mediation toward personal faith. The plague also intensified fear of purgatory and hell. With so many sudden deaths, people worried about dying unshriven, without confession, without last rites. Would they be damned? This fear drove demand for indulgences, payments to the church to reduce time in purgatory, a lucrative business for the church, but also a source of corruption and resentment. By the 16th century, the sale of indulgences would be one of the sparks igniting the Reformation. The plague also affected the cult of saints. Saints who were supposed to protect against disease became immensely popular. Saint Sebastian, Saint Roch, Saint Christopher. Churches dedicated to them. Pilgrimages, prayers, desperate hope for supernatural protection. But when the plague continued despite prayers, some questioned. Were the saints powerless? Was the church's whole system flawed? Doubt crept in. Not universal doubt. Most people remained faithful. But the unquestioning certainty of the early medieval period was gone. People had seen too much, suffered too much. Faith became more complex, more troubled, and the church's authority, once absolute, was questioned. Not openly, not yet. But the seeds were planted. The plague taught people that the church couldn't save them. That clergy were as mortal as anyone else. That ritual and prayer didn't guarantee protection. These were profound lessons, and they changed European Christianity forever. But it wasn't just religion that changed. Culture itself, art, literature, philosophy, underwent a transformation, a shift in how people saw the world, themselves, mortality. And that's where we turn next. The cultural transformation walk into a medieval church built before the plague. Look at the art, the sculptures, the paintings. You'll see Christ in glory, Mary crowned as Queen of Heaven, saints in beatific peace, bright colours, gold leaf, beauty. Death is present, yes, Christ on the cross. But it's dignified, serene, redemptive. Death leads to resurrection, to eternal life. It's hopeful. Now walk into a church built after the plague. The art has changed. Death is visceral, graphic, inescapable. Skeletons, rotting corpses, worms crawling through eye sockets. The transi-tomb becomes common, a two-level tomb. On top, the deceased as they were in life, well-dressed, noble, beautiful. Underneath, their corpse decaying, flesh falling away, ribs exposed. As you are, I once was. As I am, you will be. A memento mori, a meditation on mortality. It's not hopeful. It's stark, honest, unflinching. Because the plague generation had seen death. Real death. They couldn't romanticize it. The dance macabre, the dance of death, becomes a popular motif. Skeleton figures leading the living in a dance. To the grave. Everyone joins the dance, king and pauper, pope and peasant, young and old. Death is the great equalizer. It doesn't matter who you are, how wealthy, how powerful. Death comes for everyone. These images appeared everywhere. Painted on church walls, carved in stone, printed in books. The most famous is the mural painted in the cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris. Around 1424, a long frieze showing death leading people from all walks of life. The king protests, "I ruled the world." Death replies, "You must learn to leave it." The young woman protests, "I was so beautiful." Death replies, "Beauty fades." Grim humour, dark wisdom. It was immensely popular, copied across Europe. Why did people find this appealing? because it was true, viscerally, undeniably true. The plague had taught them life is fragile, death is certain. No amount of wealth or power or beauty can save you. So what matters? The plague generation wrestled with that question, and their answers shaped European culture. 1. Responsa: enjoy life while you can. If death is inevitable and could come tomorrow, seize the day. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague, embodies this. 10 young people flee Florence, isolate in a villa, tell stories to pass the time. The stories are bawdy, funny, irreverent, priests seducing nuns, merchants outwitting each other, lovers in scandalous affairs. It's a celebration of human folly, human pleasure, human resilience, in the face of death, laughter, joy, life. Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written a few decades later, has a similar spirit. Pilgrims from all classes telling stories, some noble, some crude, a cross-section of humanity. Flawney, fully human. Both works reflect a shift, less focus on the next life, more on this one. Not abandoning religion, but balancing it with earthly concerns. Humanism begins to emerge. The idea that human beings, human experience, human achievement matter, not just as preparation for heaven, but in their own right. The Renaissance, which flowers in the 15th and 16th centuries, has its roots here, in the plague's aftermath, in the revaluation of life and death. Petrarch, the great Italian poet, lived through the plague, lost friends, lost his beloved Laura. His poetry is deeply personal, emotional, focused on human love and loss, not religious allegory, human experience. This is new, or at least newly emphasized. The individual matters, personal feelings matter, this life matters. Art becomes more realistic. Pre-plague art was symbolic, stylized, figures were flat, backgrounds were gold. Post-plague art becomes more naturalistic. Artists study anatomy, perspective, light and shadow. They paint real human bodies, real emotions, real suffering. Giotto, painting in the early 14th century, begins this shift. His figures have weight, volume, emotion. By the 15th century, artists like Masaccio, Van Eyck, and others are painting with stunning realism. Why the change? Partly, it's the broader Renaissance focus on observation, on nature, on the real world, but it's also the plague. The plague generation had seen real bodies, real death. They couldn't accept stylized, abstract representations anymore. Art had to be honest, had to reflect reality. Literature also becomes more realistic. Dante's Divine Comedy, written just before the plague, is allegorical. A journey through hell, purgatory, and paradise. But the sinners and saints Dante encounters are real people, with real stories. He names names, settles scores, makes his political enemies suffer in hell. It's a blend. Allegory grounded in real human experience. Post-plague literature goes further. Christine de Pizan, writing in the early 15th century, addresses real social issues. Women's rights, just governance. Her work is practical. Engage with the world. Philosophy shifts too. Scholasticism, the medieval approach of reconciling faith and reason through logical argument, begins to feel inadequate. The plague raised questions scholasticism couldn't answer. Why do the innocent suffer? Why does God allow such horror? The old answers, divine mystery, original sin, God's inscrutable will rang hollow. New approaches emerged. Nominalism, skepticism, emphasis on observation and experience over logical deduction. William of Ockham, an English philosopher who died in the plague, emphasized simplicity. Occam's razor. Don't multiply entities unnecessarily. The simplest explanation is usually correct. This approach valued empirical evidence over abstract reasoning. It's a step toward the scientific method. The plague also changed architecture. Churches built after the plague are different. Less monumental, more intimate, more focus on chapels for private prayer, chantries for the dead, less focus on the grand communal space, because people's relationship with religion had become more personal, more individual. Public, communal worship remained important, but private devotion grew. Music changed too. The Ars Nova, new art style, emerged in the 14th century, more complex, more expressive, more emotional. The Dies Irae, Day of Wrath, became a common theme. A hymn about Judgment Day, the end of the world. Its melody is haunting, mournful, urgent. It reflects the apocalyptic mood of the post-plague era. And then there's the printing press. Gutenberg's press isn't invented until the 1450s, a century after the Black Death, but the plague created conditions for its success. Literacy had been growing. More demand for books. The plague killed many scribes, made hand-copied books even more expensive and scarce. A labor-saving technology, mechanical printing, became valuable. And once printing spread, it accelerated all the cultural changes. More books, cheaper books, ideas spreading faster. The Reformation, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, none of these were caused by the plague. But the plague created a world more receptive to change. A world that had seen the old certainties collapse, a world willing to question, to innovate, to imagine differently. The plague was a rupture. It broke the medieval world, culturally, socially, economically, religiously, and in the ruins, something new began to grow, not immediately, not cleanly. There were centuries of struggle ahead. War, reformation, revolution. But the trajectory was set. The modern world, in a strange way, was born in the plague pits of the 14th century. From the worst catastrophe in human history came transformation. Not because the plague was good. It was horror. But because it shattered structures that had lasted 1,000 years and forced survivors to rebuild, to reimagine, to create anew. That's the paradox of the Black Death. It killed half the world and changed the other half forever. The plague returns. The year is 1353. The first wave of the Black Death has passed. Europe has lost perhaps half its population. The survivors are burying the dead, trying to rebuild. There's a sense of relief. It's over. We survived. But the plague wasn't over. It was just beginning. Because Yersinia pestis had established itself in European rodent populations, it had found a permanent home in rats, in the fleas that fed on them, and every few years conditions would align. Rodent populations would surge, fleas would multiply, and plague would return. The second pandemic struck in 1361-1363, not as severe as the first, but deadly enough. Perhaps 10 to 20% mortality this time. It hit children especially hard. Those born after 1348 had no immunity, no prior exposure. Adults who'd survived the first plague had some immunity. Their bodies had fought off the infection, built antibodies. But children, vulnerable. This plague was called the pestilence of children. Families who'd survived the Black Death, who'd managed to rebuild, lost their children. The psychological impact was devastating. They'd endured the worst catastrophe in history, and now it was happening again. The plague returned in 1369-1371, again in 1374-1375, again in 1390-1391, every decade or so, like clockwork. Sometimes it was localized, a single city, a region. Sometimes it was widespread, across multiple countries, but it was always there. always threatening. For 3 centuries, Europe lived with plague, recurring, endemic, a fact of life. Children grew up knowing that plague could strike any summer, that you might wake up healthy and be dead in 3 days. It shaped psychology, culture, behavior. Cities developed plague protocols. At the first sign of illness, quarantine, infected households were marked. A white cross painted on the door. Lord, have mercy on us. The family sealed inside. Food left at the door. No contact allowed. If you were infected or even suspected of infection, you were isolated. Often, entire families died together, locked in their homes. It was cruel, but it saved others. Venice, Milan, and other Italian cities developed sophisticated public health systems. Health boards, lazaretti, plague hospitals on isolated islands. Incoming ships were quarantined for 40 days. Cargo inspected, infected goods burned. These measures worked. Partially, they slowed transmission, reduced mortality, but they couldn't eliminate plague, because the reservoir, the infected rodents, remained. Rats in the sewers, in granaries, in ships' holds, fleas everywhere. Kill the rats in one area and more moved in. Plague was a hydra. Cut off one head, 2 more grew. Some outbreaks were localized, others became epidemics. The Great Plague of London in 1665 to 1666 killed 100,000 people, a quarter of the city. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist, recorded it, June 7, 1665. This day, much against my will, I did in Drury Lane see 2 or 3 houses marked with a red cross upon the doors, and Lord, have mercy upon us writ there, which was a sad sight to me. By September, Pepys wrote, but now, how few people I see, and those looking like people that had taken leave of the world. London became a ghost city. The wealthy fled, the poor suffered. Entire streets abandoned. Grass growing in the roads. The plague ended only when the Great Fire of London in 1666 burned much of the city. The fire destroyed infected buildings, killed rats, disrupted the cycle. Unintentionally, the fire accomplished what medicine couldn't. Marseille, France, experienced a major outbreak in 1720. The plague arrived on a merchant ship from the Levant. Authorities should have quarantined it, but the ship's cargo was valuable: silks, fabrics. Merchants pressured officials. The ship was allowed to unload. Plague spread, 100,000 dead in Marseille and surrounding regions. It was the last major plague outbreak in Western Europe. Why did plague finally disappear from Europe? We're not entirely sure. Several factors likely contributed. First, the black rat, Rattus rattus, was displaced by the brown rat, Rattus norvegicus. The brown rat is larger, more aggressive. It outcompeted the black rat. And crucially, the brown rat lives in sewers and burrows. Less contact with humans. The black rat lived in houses, attics, grain stores, close to people. So when the brown rat took over, the primary vector for plague transmission was reduced. Second, housing improved. Stone and brick replaced wood and thatch. Fewer gaps. Fewer places for rats to nest. Better urban planning. Wider streets. Better sanitation. Not great by modern standards, but better than medieval conditions. Third, quarantine and public health measures improved. Centuries of plague taught authorities how to respond. Isolate the sick. Quarantine travellers. Inspect ships. Control trade. It wasn't perfect, but it helped. Fourth, climate change. The Little Ice Age was ending. Warmer, drier conditions. Plague thrives in certain temperature and humidity ranges. Changes in climate may have disrupted the flea, rat, human cycle. Fifth, perhaps the bacterium itself evolved. Natural selection favors pathogens that spread without killing their hosts too quickly. A less virulent strain might have outcompeted the more deadly strain. We can't confirm this without genetic evidence from different time periods. But it's possible. Whatever the reasons, by the 18th century, plague outbreaks in Western Europe became rare. The last major outbreak in England was 1679. In France, 1720. In Eastern Europe, outbreaks continued into the 19th century. The Balkans, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, but Western Europe was largely free. The terror that had haunted Europe for 3 centuries finally faded. But plague didn't disappear from the world. The third pandemic began in the 1850s. In Yunnan province, China, plague spread along trade routes to Hong Kong, to India. By the 1890s, it was in Bombay, killing millions. It spread globally, by ship, to San Francisco in 1900, to Sydney, to South Africa, to South America. This was when scientists finally identified the bacterium. Alexander Yersin, in 1894, isolated Yersinia pestis in Hong Kong, named after him. Shibasoburo Kitasato made the same discovery independently around the same time, and Paul Louis Simond, in 1898, identified the flea as the vector. He observed that plague spread through rat populations before jumping to humans. That dead rats preceded human cases. That fleas from infected rats could transmit plague. Finally, after centuries, the mechanism was understood. This knowledge allowed better public health responses. Rat control, flea control, quarantine based on actual transmission routes, not superstition. Antibiotics, developed in the mid-20th century, made plague treatable. Streptomycin, tetracycline, fluoroquinolones. With prompt treatment, survival rates are high, over 90%, but untreated, plague is still deadly, and it's still with us. Endemic in rodent populations in parts of Central Asia, Madagascar, the American Southwest. There are still cases, thousands per year globally, mostly in rural areas, people handling infected animals, hunters, herders. With antibiotics, most survive, but if access to medicine is limited, plague can still kill. In Madagascar, there are recurring outbreaks. Bubonic and pneumonic plague, hundreds of cases, dozens of deaths. In the United States, a few cases each year, usually in rural areas. New Mexico, Colorado, California. Prairie dogs and ground squirrels serve as reservoirs. Someone gets bitten by an infected flea, gets sick. Usually, they're treated and recover. But it's a reminder, plague never really went away. It's still out there, still capable of killing. The difference is, we understand it now. We can treat it. But that knowledge was hard-won. Centuries of suffering. Millions of deaths. The Black Death and its recurring waves shaped Europe, shaped the world, not just through the immediate deaths, but through the long-term changes, the social transformations, the economic shifts, the cultural evolution, and also through the slow development of public health. The idea that disease can be controlled, that societies can organize to protect their populations, that science, observation, and rational policy can save lives. These ideas were forged in the crucible of plague. They weren't unique to plague. Other diseases also drove public health advances: smallpox, cholera, tuberculosis. But plague was the first, the most devastating, the most formative. It taught humanity that epidemics could be fought, not with prayers alone, not with scapegoating, not with superstition, but with observation, isolation, hygiene, science. That lesson, learned over centuries of suffering, is one of plague's legacies, along with the graveyards, the abandoned villages, the cultural trauma, and the knowledge that civilization is fragile. that a microbe, invisible to the naked eye, can bring the world to its knees. We know that now. We've always known it, viscerally, since 1347, but we sometimes forget, until the next pandemic reminds us. Beyond Europe plague, in the wider world, we've focused on Europe. But the Black Death wasn't a European phenomenon. It was a pandemic, global, and its impact beyond Europe is equally important. Let's start in the Middle East. The plague reached the Islamic world in 1347. Almost simultaneously with Europe, Alexandria, Egypt, a major port. Plague arrived on ships from the Black Sea. From there, it spread to Cairo, Damascus, Baghdad, Mecca. The Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt and Syria, was devastated. Cairo, one of the world's great cities, lost perhaps a third of its population. Al-Makrizi, an Egyptian historian, wrote Cairo became an abandoned desert without any activity of human beings or animals. The mosques were completely deserted. There was no call to prayer, no gathering for prayer. The same silence we saw in Europe. In Damascus, the historian Ibn Kathir recorded, the number of people who died in a day reached 2,000. The corpses were piled up in the streets. The plague spread to Mecca during the Hajj season. Pilgrims from across the Islamic world gathered. Exposed, returned home infected. The pilgrimage became a vector for spreading plague, similar to how European trade routes spread it. The Ottoman Empire, rising in Anatolia, was also affected, though perhaps less severely than the Mamluk Sultanate. The Ottomans would eventually benefit from the weakening of rival states. Their expansion in the 15th and 16th centuries was facilitated, in part, by the plague's disruption of established powers. In Persia, the Ilkhanate Mongol successor state was hit hard. Already weakened by internal strife, the plague contributed to its collapse. By the 1350s, the Ilkhanate fragmented. Plague also affected the Mongol Empire itself. The Golden Horde, ruling much of Russia and Central Asia, suffered massive losses. The empire, already overstretched, began to fracture. The plague didn't cause the Mongol collapse, but it was a contributing factor. In China, the situation is less clear. Records from the 1330s and 1340s describe unusual mortality, likely plague, possibly originating in the same Central Asian reservoirs that seeded the European pandemic. But Chinese sources from this period are fragmentary. The Yuan dynasty, ruled by the Mongols, was in decline. Plague, floods, famines, rebellions all combined to destabilize the empire. By 1368, the Yuan dynasty fell. The Ming dynasty rose. How much did plague contribute? Hard to say definitively, but the timing suggests it played a role. In India, evidence is even more sparse. Some sources suggest plague reached India in the 14th century, but definitive records are lacking. It's possible the subcontinent was affected, or possibly it escaped the worst of the pandemic. Geography, climate, and trade patterns all influence plague's spread. India's relative isolation from the main Silk Road routes may have provided some protection, or records were lost, or plague was attributed to other causes. We simply don't know for certain. In sub-Saharan Africa, the Black Death's impact is unclear. North Africa was definitely affected. Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, ports and trade cities suffered. But did the plague spread south of the Sahara? The evidence is ambiguous. Some historians argue the Sahara Desert acted as a barrier. Limited trade contact meant limited plague transmission. Others suggest plague may have reached sub-Saharan Africa but wasn't recorded. Oral histories, lost records, different disease interpretations. Again, we can't be certain. What we do know is that the plague's impact varied by region. Europe was devastated, 30-60% mortality. The Middle East was also severely hit, perhaps 30-40%. Central Asia, the origin point, likely suffered heavily as well. But exact figures are hard to confirm. China may have experienced significant mortality, but records are incomplete. South and Southeast Asia, unclear. Sub-Saharan Africa, possibly spared or possibly unrecorded. The Americas, of course, were isolated. No contact with Eurasia yet. Plague didn't reach the New World until much later. But when Europeans arrived in the 15th and 16th centuries, they brought diseases. Smallpox, measles, influenza, not plague initially, but equally devastating to populations with no immunity. The Columbian Exchange, in a grim way, echoed the Black Death. Epidemics killing 50-90% of indigenous populations in the Americas. Entire civilizations collapsed, not from conquest, primarily from disease. The same dynamic the Black Death had demonstrated in Eurasia, that infectious disease in connected populations can be civilization ending. Back to the 14th century, the Black Death reshaped the Islamic world just as it did Europe. Economic disruption, labor shortages, social upheaval, but also cultural and intellectual changes. Islamic medicine, already advanced, grappled with the plague. Ibn al-Khatib, a 14th century Andalusian physician and historian, observed that plague spread through contact. He wrote, "The existence of contagion is established by experience, investigation, and sensory evidence, and he who believes in contagion must take precautions." This was remarkably insightful. Contagion theory, before germ theory. But it was controversial. Islamic theology, like Christian theology, struggled with the idea of contagion. If disease was divinely ordained, could it be prevented by human action? If plague was God's will, was avoiding the sick a lack of faith? These debates mirrored those in Christian Europe, and the answers varied. Some embraced practical measures, quarantine, isolation. Others trusted in divine protection. Islamic scholars also produced plague treatises, works discussing symptoms, treatments, theological implications, similar to European plague literature, but with different theological frameworks, references to the Quran and Hadith rather than the Bible. One famous Hadith stated that Muslims should not enter or leave a plague-afflicted area, effectively quarantine, divinely sanctioned. This provided religious justification for public health measures. In some ways, Islamic societies had advantages in responding to plague. Emphasis on cleanliness, ritual washing, hygiene practices. These didn't prevent plague. Bubonic plague is flea-borne, not dirt-borne, but they helped with other diseases. Public baths, hospitals, charitable endowments funding medical care. Islamic cities had developed public health infrastructure earlier than many European cities, but none of it was enough against plague. The bacterium didn't care about religion, or culture, or medical knowledge. It killed indiscriminately, and the impact across cultures was similar. Mass death, social disruption, economic transformation, cultural trauma, humanity's first truly global catastrophe, linked by trade, by the Silk Road, by ships crossing seas. The same networks that spread goods and ideas also spread death. It's a lesson we've relearned repeatedly. The 1918 influenza pandemic, global, spread by ships and trains, 50 million dead. COVID-19, global, spread by air travel, millions dead. The pattern is the same. Connectivity enables pandemic. The Black Death was the first to demonstrate this on a massive scale, And its legacy is the knowledge that we're all connected, that a disease emerging in one region can, within months, reach everywhere, that no border, no ocean, no wall can fully protect against a pathogen. This is both terrifying and humbling. We like to think of ourselves as separate, distinct, independent, but epidemics reveal the truth. We're one interconnected species, sharing a planet, sharing vulnerabilities. The Black Death taught that lesson in the harshest possible way, and the world has never forgotten. Medical understanding from miasma to microbes for most of human history. We didn't understand disease, we saw symptoms, we saw death, but the cause, invisible, unknown. In the ancient world, disease was attributed to the gods. Divine punishment, angry spirits, Hippocrates and Galen, the Greek physicians, proposed a more naturalistic theory. The four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile. Health was balance, disease was imbalance. Treatment involved restoring balance, bloodletting, purging, diet. It was wrong, completely wrong, but it was rational, based on observation, even if the interpretation was flawed, and it dominated Western medicine for nearly 2,000 years. In the Islamic world, physicians like Ibn Sina's Avicenna refined humoral theory, added observations, improved treatments, but the fundamental framework remained. When the Black Death struck, physicians tried to understand it within this framework. Plague was caused by an imbalance of humours, excess black bile, corruption of the blood triggered by external factors, bad air, miasma. Miasma theory held that disease was spread by foul odours, poisonous vapours, swamps, rotting matter, corpses, all produced miasma. Breathing it caused illness. This theory made intuitive sense. Plague cities smelled terrible, bodies rotting. Sewage, decay. The correlation seemed obvious. Bad smell equals disease. So treatments focused on combating bad air, burning incense, carrying aromatic herbs, wearing sachets of flowers. The plague doctor's beak mask, stuffed with spices and herbs, was meant to filter miasma. It didn't work, because miasma wasn't the cause. But no one knew that. Some physicians observed that plague seemed to spread from person to person. Touch a sick person, get sick yourself. Contagion theory. The idea that disease could be transmitted through contact. This was closer to the truth. But it competed with miasma theory, and with theological explanations. If disease was contagious, was it still divine punishment? Could you avoid God's wrath by avoiding sick people? Or was that a lack of faith? These debates raged among physicians, among theologians. Meanwhile, plague kept killing. Treatments ranged from useless to harmful. Bloodletting, purging, laxatives, emetics, all designed to restore humoral balance. They weakened patients, made outcomes worse. Some tried theriac, a compound medicine made from dozens of ingredients. Snake flesh, opium, spices, herbs. It was expensive, prestigious, and utterly ineffective against plague. Some tried lancing the bebos, draining the pus. This occasionally helped, reducing bacterial load, relieving pain, but often it just spread infection. Cauterization, burning the buboes with hot irons, agonizing, and ineffective. Prayer, relics, holy water, desperate hope, no medical benefit. For centuries, this was the state of plague medicine: guesswork, tradition, desperation, no understanding of the actual cause, no effective treatment. Then, in the 17th century, something changed. The microscope was invented. Antony van Leeuwenhoek, in the 1670s, observed animalculas, tiny living creatures invisible to the naked eye. Bacteria, protozoa, a hidden world. It was astonishing, but it didn't immediately change medicine. No one connected these tiny creatures to disease. Not yet. In the 18th century, smallpox inoculation was introduced to Europe. From the Ottoman Empire, where it had been practiced for decades, deliberately infecting people with a mild case of smallpox to prevent a severe case. It worked. Not perfectly, but it reduced mortality. Edward Jenner, in 1796, developed vaccination, using cowpox to prevent smallpox. Safer, more effective. This was revolutionary. Disease prevention through medical intervention, not based on humoral theory, based on observation and experiment. The scientific method applied to medicine. In the 19th century, the pace of discovery accelerated. Ignaz Semmelweis in the 1840s showed that hand-washing reduced childbed fever. Doctors going from autopsies to deliveries were spreading disease. Wash your hands, and fewer women died. His colleagues mocked him. It challenged their professional pride, but he was right. John Snow, in 1854, traced a cholera outbreak in London to a contaminated water pump, removed the pump handle, and the outbreak stopped. Epidemiology, tracing disease to its source. Louis Pasteur, in the 1860s, demonstrated that microorganisms caused fermentation and spoilage. Germ theory. Diseases weren't spontaneous. They were caused by living organisms. This was the breakthrough. Robert Koch, in the 1870s and 1880s, identified specific bacteria causing specific diseases. Anthrax, tuberculosis, cholera. Koch postulates criteria for proving a microorganism causes a disease. Isolate the organism, grow it in culture, infect a healthy host, observe the same disease. This became the gold standard, and in 1894, Alexandra Yersin and Shibosaboru Kitasato independently identified Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that caused plague. Finally, after 500 years, the Black Death's cause was known. Not miasma, not divine wrath, not humoral imbalance, a bacterium carried by fleas, spread by rats. With this knowledge, effective public health measures became possible. Rat control, flea control, quarantine based on actual transmission routes, and by the 1940s, antibiotics. Streptomycin, discovered by Selman Waksman in 1943, was effective against plague. For the first time in history, plague could be cured, not just prevented, not just managed, cured. If caught early, survival rates were over 90%. The disease that had killed 200 million people was now treatable. This is one of the great triumphs of medical science. From ignorance to understanding, from helplessness to treatment. It took centuries, cost millions of lives, but we got there, and the lesson is profound. Observation, experiment, evidence, not tradition, not authority, not assumption. That's how knowledge advances. The Black Death killed indiscriminately for 500 years, because we didn't understand it. Once we understood it, we could fight it. This pattern has repeated. Smallpox, polio, many bacterial infections. Once we understood the cause, we developed treatments, vaccines, cures, and today we face new diseases, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, new viruses, emerging pathogens. But we have tools our ancestors didn't. Genomic sequencing, epidemiological modeling, rapid vaccine development. The COVID-19 pandemic demonstrated this. A novel virus identified within weeks, genome sequenced. Vaccines developed in under a year. Not perfect. Not fast enough to prevent millions of deaths. But unprecedented in human history. The Black Death killed for centuries before we even knew what it was. COVID-19 had vaccines within a year of identification. That's progress, born from the long, painful process of learning how disease works, a process that began, in many ways, with the Black Death. When physicians first observed, first questioned, first tried to understand, they failed. For centuries they failed, but they kept trying, and eventually understanding emerged. The invisible killer became visible. The untreatable became treatable, and humanity gained a measure of control over the epidemics that had haunted us since the beginning. That's the legacy of medical science, built on the graves of plague victims, shaped by the desperate need to stop the dying. A legacy we still benefit from today. Lesson from the Black Death: what can the 14th century teach the 21st? Centuries separate us from the Black Death. We have antibiotics, vaccines, modern medicine. We understand germ theory, epidemiology, public health. Surely we're beyond the reach of medieval catastrophes. And yet, the lessons of the Black Death remain relevant, because the fundamental dynamics haven't changed. Pathogens still evolve, still spread, still kill. Human nature remains constant. Our responses to fear, to uncertainty, to mass death, and our interconnected world creates vulnerabilities our ancestors never imagined. Let's explore what the Black Death teaches us. Lesson 1: interconnection creates vulnerability. The Black Death spread because of trade. The Silk Road, maritime networks, pilgrimage routes. Connection enabled pandemic. Today, we're more connected than ever. Air travel, global supply chains, instantaneous communication. A virus can spread from Wuhan to Milan to New York in days, before anyone realizes what's happening. COVID-19 demonstrated this. A novel coronavirus identified in December 2019. By March 2020, it was on every continent, every country. Lockdowns, borders closed, travel banned, but too late. The virus was everywhere. The same dynamic as 1347, just faster. Connection brings benefits, trade, knowledge, cultural exchange. But it also brings risk. A pathogen emerging anywhere can threaten everywhere. This is the price of globalization, and we need to reckon with it. Better surveillance, rapid response, international cooperation, because isolation isn't an option, not anymore. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not. Lesson 2: institutions can fail. The medieval church was the most powerful institution in Europe. It promised protection, intercession, salvation, and when plague struck, it failed. Prayers didn't stop the dying. Relics didn't protect. Clergy died alongside everyone else. The church's authority never fully recovered. Today, we trust different institutions, governments, health agencies, science, and when pandemic strikes, we expect them to protect us. Sometimes they succeed. Vaccines developed, treatments distributed, but sometimes they fail. Slow responses, political interference, misinformation, supply shortages. COVID-19 exposed weaknesses in institutions we thought robust. Healthcare systems overwhelmed, governments unprepared, international organizations sidelined, and trust eroded. This is dangerous, because effective pandemic response requires trust. Trust in public health guidance, trust in vaccines, trust in collective action. When institutions fail, when trust collapses, people improvise. They turn to alternative sources. Conspiracy theories, quack cures, denial. Just as medieval people turned to flagellants and scapegoating when the church failed, institutions must be resilient, competent, trustworthy, because in a crisis they're all we have. Lesson 3: misinformation kills. Medieval people believed miasma caused plague. Bad air? So they burned incense, carried flowers, wore beak masks filled with spices. It didn't work, because the theory was wrong, but it seemed plausible. It fit their understanding. Today, we have better science, But we still have misinformation. COVID-19 brought a flood of false claims. The virus was a hoax. Masks don't work. Vaccines are dangerous. Drink bleach. Some were ignorant mistakes. Some were deliberate disinformation. Either way, people died. They avoided masks, avoided vaccines, took dangerous cures, and they spread the virus to loved ones, to communities. Misinformation in a pandemic is deadly. The Black Death taught this. Bad medical theory led to harmful treatments. Scapegoating led to massacres of Jewish communities. Wrong beliefs have real consequences. Today, we must fight misinformation as vigorously as we fight pathogens. Clear communication, scientific literacy, trustworthy sources, because belief shapes behavior, and behavior determines who lives and who dies. Lesson 4: inequality shapes outcomes. The Black Death killed rich and poor, noble and peasant, but not equally. The wealthy could flee to country estates, had better nutrition, better housing. The poor were trapped in crowded cities, malnourished, vulnerable. They died in greater numbers. The same pattern today. COVID-19 hit disadvantaged communities harder. Overcrowded housing, jobs that couldn't be done remotely, limited healthcare access. Black and Latino communities in the US experienced higher mortality rates. Developing countries struggled to access vaccines while wealthy nations stockpiled doses. Inequality kills. In the 14th century, in the 21st, pandemics expose and exacerbate existing disparities. If we want to be prepared for the next pandemic, we need to address inequality, universal healthcare, equitable vaccine distribution, support for vulnerable populations, not just for moral reasons, though those are compelling, but for practical reasons. A virus doesn't respect borders or class divisions. If it spreads unchecked in one population, it threatens everyone. We're only as safe as the most vulnerable among us. The Black Death taught this. Nobles fleeing plague still got sick, because you can't quarantine yourself from a pandemic world. Lesson 5: society is fragile. Medieval Europe seemed stable. The feudal order had lasted centuries. The church was eternal. The social hierarchy divinely ordained. Then half the population died, and everything changed. The feudal system collapsed. The church's authority weakened. Social mobility increased. The medieval world ended. The Renaissance began. Pandemics can shatter societies. Not always. Not immediately. But the stress reveals cracks, exposes weaknesses, accelerates change. COVID-19 disrupted everything: work, education, healthcare, politics, culture. Some changes were temporary. We've returned to normal in many ways, but some changes will persist. Remote work, telemedicine, changed political landscapes, altered social behaviors. The pandemic accelerated trends already underway, made them visible, made them urgent. We don't yet know what the long-term consequences will be, what institutions will weaken, what new structures will emerge, but history suggests the impacts will be profound. The Black Death reshaped civilization. Every major pandemic does. We should be thoughtful about what kind of world we're building in pandemic's wake. Lesson 6: preparedness matters. The 14th century had no warning, no preparation. Plague arrived suddenly, spread rapidly, killed indiscriminately. They had no defenses, no effective treatments, no understanding. They did the best they could, and millions died. By the 17th and 18th centuries, after repeated plague outbreaks, Europe had learned. Quarantine protocols, plague hospitals, public health boards. These measures weren't perfect, but they saved lives. Preparedness matters. Today we know pandemics will happen. It's not if, but when. Novel influenzas, coronaviruses, antibiotic-resistant bacteria, potential bioweapons. The threats are numerous. Are we prepared? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. Wealthier nations have pandemic response plans, stockpiles, surveillance systems. Poorer nations often don't, and even prepared nations can be overwhelmed. COVID-19 proved that. We need better preparedness, early warning systems, rapid response capabilities, vaccine development infrastructure, international cooperation, funding, political will. It's expensive. It requires foresight and sustained commitment. But it's far cheaper than the alternative. The Black Death killed 200 million people, devastated economies, ended dynasties. COVID-19, with modern medicine, still killed millions, cost trillions. Imagine the next pandemic without preparation. We can't afford complacency. Lesson 7. Human resilience is extraordinary. The plague generation endured unimaginable horror. They watched half their world die. Families destroyed, communities shattered, futures erased. And yet they survived. They buried their dead, rebuilt their cities, continued their lives. They had children, created art, pursued knowledge. Out of catastrophe, they built something new. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the modern world. Not because plague was good, it was horror, but because humans, confronted with devastation, find ways to endure, to adapt, to create. COVID-19 revealed this too. Healthcare workers risking their lives daily, scientists working around the clock, communities supporting each other, acts of courage, kindness, creativity, virtual concerts, neighborhood support networks, innovations in remote connection. Amid the grief and fear and anger, there was also resilience. That's the human story. We suffer. We endure. We rebuild. The Black Death couldn't destroy humanity. Neither can any pandemic. We are more than our vulnerabilities. We are also our capacity to adapt, to learn, to persevere. That's the ultimate lesson. Not that pandemics are inevitable. They are. Not that they're devastating. They are. But that we can survive them, learn from them, emerge changed but unbroken. The plague generation did. And so can we. Modern parallels and pandemic preparedness stand in a modern city. Any major metropolis. Millions of people living close together, traveling constantly. Global supply chains delivering food, goods, medicine. Air travel connecting continents. Trains, buses, subways. Now imagine a novel pathogen, highly contagious, significant mortality, spreading before symptoms appear. How long until it reaches every neighborhood, every city, every country? Days, maybe weeks. We've seen it. COVID-19 spread globally in months. We're living in a world more vulnerable to pandemic than the medieval world. Not because our medicine is worse. It's vastly better, but because our connectivity is unprecedented. And our population is enormous. Nearly 8 billion people. A pathogen has more hosts than ever before, more opportunities to spread, to mutate, to persist. So what are we doing about it? Let's look at modern pandemic preparedness, surveillance. We monitor for emerging diseases, disease surveillance networks. Labs around the world, WHO, the World Health Organization, coordinates international efforts. CDC in the US, ECDC in Europe. National health agencies everywhere. They track outbreaks, identify new pathogens, alert governments. When a strange pneumonia appeared in Wuhan in late 2019, Chinese doctors reported it. Within weeks, the virus was sequenced, shared globally. That's unprecedented. The Black Death spread for years before anyone understood it was the same disease. COVID-19 was identified, sequenced, and publicized in weeks. But surveillance has limits. It requires reporting, transparency, resources. Some countries lack surveillance infrastructure, can't detect outbreaks early. Some governments suppress information, delay reporting, hide outbreaks, and some diseases evade detection, spread silently, asymptomatically. Surveillance is crucial, but it's not sufficient. Rapid response. Once an outbreak is detected, how quickly can we respond? Quarantine, contact tracing, isolation. These are ancient tools, used since medieval plague, but modern technology enhances them. Digital contact tracing, using phones to track exposure, rapid testing, identifying infected individuals within hours, genomic sequencing, tracking virus variants, understanding transmission chains. These tools work when deployed quickly, when used widely. South Korea, Taiwan, New Zealand, they responded rapidly to COVID-19. Aggressive testing, contact tracing, quarantine. They controlled outbreaks, minimized deaths. Other countries responded slowly, denied the threat, delayed action. The virus spread, deaths mounted. Rapid response requires preparation, stockpiles, plans, political will, and it requires public cooperation. Quarantine only works if people comply. Testing only works if people get tested. Contact tracing only works if people share information. This requires trust in government, in public health, in each other. When trust is low, response is slow. Medical countermeasures, vaccines, treatments, medications. COVID-19 vaccines were developed in record time, less than a year from virus identification to vaccine authorization. mRNA technology, years of prior research, global collaboration, massive investment. It was a triumph, but distribution was unequal. Wealthy nations vaccinated their populations. Poorer nations waited. This isn't just unjust. It's dangerous. Unvaccinated populations become reservoirs. The virus continues circulating, mutating, new variants emerge. Some evade vaccines, and the pandemic continues. Global vaccination is in everyone's interest, not just the vaccinated populations, everyone's, because viruses don't respect borders. We need systems for rapid, equitable vaccine production and distribution. Not just for COVID-19, for the next pandemic. Treatments are also crucial. Antivirals, monoclonal antibodies, supportive care. These save lives, reduce severity, ease healthcare burden, but they require research, investment, manufacturing capacity, and equitable access. Stockpiling is important, but challenging. Vaccines expire, medications degrade, equipment becomes obsolete. You can't stockpile everything forever. We need flexible manufacturing, ability to rapidly scale production for whatever the next threat is. Healthcare capacity. Even with vaccines and treatments, some people get severely ill. They need hospitals, ICUs, ventilators, healthcare workers. COVID-19 overwhelmed hospitals worldwide. ICUs full, equipment shortages, staff exhausted. In wealthier nations with robust healthcare systems, this was difficult. In poorer nations with limited healthcare infrastructure, it was catastrophic. Healthcare capacity isn't just about beds and equipment. It's about people. Trained doctors, nurses, technicians, and they need support. PPE, personal protective equipment, safe working conditions, mental health support. During COVID-19, healthcare workers faced impossible choices. Who gets the last ventilator? Who gets treated when resources are scarce? Burnout, PTSD, moral injury. We can't prepare for pandemics without investing in healthcare, not just hospitals. Public health infrastructure, epidemiologists, contact tracers, health educators. These aren't luxuries. They're necessities. The Black Death showed what happens when healthcare is inadequate. Physicians fleeing, hospitals overwhelmed, mass death. We have better tools now, but we still need capacity. International cooperation. Pandemics are global. Responses must be too. No nation can protect itself alone. A virus spreading unchecked in one country threatens all countries. We need international cooperation, sharing information, sharing resources, sharing vaccines. WHO is supposed to coordinate this, but it's underfunded, politically constrained. National interests often override global needs. Vaccine nationalism, export bans, blame games. This is short-sighted. The Black Death didn't stop at borders. Neither will future pandemics. We need stronger international institutions, better cooperation, genuine solidarity, not just during crises, before them, investing in global health infrastructure, supporting poorer nations, building trust, because the next pandemic could start anywhere and it will affect everyone. Research and innovation. The fight against infectious disease is a race. Pathogens evolve. We must stay ahead. We need ongoing research. Understanding how diseases spread, how immunity works, how to develop better vaccines and treatments, basic science, epidemiology, clinical trials. This requires funding, long-term funding, not just during crisis, because the next pandemic threat might be brewing now. A virus mutating in an animal reservoir, a bacterium developing antibiotic resistance. We need to identify threats early. Develop countermeasures before they're needed. We also need innovation, new vaccine technologies. mRNA showed promise. What's next? New diagnostic tools. Faster, cheaper, more accessible. New treatment modalities. Antivirals, immunotherapies. Innovation requires investment, risk-taking, failure tolerance. Many research avenues won't pan out, but some will, and those breakthroughs save millions of lives. Public engagement. All the preparedness in the world fails if the public doesn't cooperate. Vaccines only work if people take them. Quarantine only works if people comply. Masks only work if people wear them. Public engagement is crucial. Clear communication, honest, science-based, empathetic, not fear-mongering, not minimizing, honest assessment. This is harder than it sounds. Science evolves, recommendations change, uncertainty is inherent, but the public wants certainty, clear answers, simple solutions. Navigating this tension is difficult. COVID-19 showed the consequences of failure, mixed messages, political interference, misinformation. Compliance suffered, trust eroded, deaths increased. We need to do better. Invest in science communication, build trust, engage communities, listen to concerns, address them honestly, because in a pandemic, everyone is part of the response, not just governments and doctors. Everyone. The medieval world couldn't coordinate a global response. They had no means, no understanding, no infrastructure. They faced plague with prayers and panic. We have the tools to do better. Science, technology, resources, knowledge. But tools aren't enough. We need will, political will, social will, collective commitment to prepare, to respond, to support each other. Because the next pandemic is coming. We don't know when. We don't know what pathogen. But it will come. And when it does, will we be ready? Conclusion: living with invisible threats. Picture that village street again. Autumn 1348. Empty. Silent. Abandoned. The plague had passed through. Half the village dead. But the survivors remained. They buried the dead, replened the houses, replanted the fields. Life continued, changed, haunted, but continuing, because that's what humans do. We endure. The Black Death was the worst catastrophe in recorded history. 75 to 200 million people dead. Half of Europe gone. Families destroyed. Villages abandoned. Civilizations shaken. And yet, Europe survived, rebuilt, transformed. The Renaissance, the Reformation, the Enlightenment, the modern world, all built on the ruins of the plague years. Not because the plague was good, it was horror, but because survivors found ways forward. They questioned authority, pursued knowledge, reimagined society. They turned trauma into transformation. This is humanity's pattern. We face catastrophe, we suffer, we endure, we adapt. We're living through our own pandemic now. COVID-19, millions dead, economies disrupted, lives upended. It's not the Black Death. Our medicine is better, our understanding deeper, but it's still tragedy, still trauma, and we're still grappling with the aftermath. What have we learned? That we're vulnerable. That connectivity brings risk. That preparedness matters. That inequality kills. That institutions can fail. That misinformation spreads faster than truth. But also that we're resilient. That healthcare workers will risk everything to help others. That scientists will work tirelessly to develop vaccines. That communities will support each other through crisis. That even in the darkest times, there's kindness, courage, hope. The Black Death teaches us that pandemics end, not quickly, not cleanly, but eventually. The acute phase passes, the dying slows, normalcy of a sort returns, but the world is changed. Some changes are temporary, crisis measures relaxed. Some are permanent, new institutions, new priorities, new perspectives. We're still discovering what COVID-19's lasting changes will be, how it will reshape work, education, healthcare, society. But we know it will. Just as the Black Death reshaped medieval Europe. The question is, what kind of change? Will we build a more resilient world, better prepared for the next pandemic? Or will we forget the lessons, return to complacency, leave ourselves vulnerable? History suggests we forget too easily. Plague ravaged Europe repeatedly for centuries. Each time, people were shocked, unprepared. Despite knowing it could return, despite having experienced it before, memory fades, urgency wanes, investment dries up until the next crisis, and then it's too late. We can't afford that pattern anymore, not with 8 billion people, global travel, climate change creating new disease reservoirs. The next pandemic might be worse than COVID-19, a more lethal virus, a more contagious pathogen, a resistant bacterium. We can prepare, or we can hope it doesn't happen. The Black Death shows us the cost of being unprepared. So what do? We invest in surveillance, in healthcare, in research, in global cooperation. We build resilient institutions, trustworthy, competent, equitable. We combat misinformation, support science literacy, communicate honestly. We address inequality because our collective safety depends on it. We remember. We teach these lessons to the next generation so they're not caught unprepared. But beyond practical measures, there's something deeper. The Black Death teaches us about mortality, about the fragility of life, the certainty of death. Medieval people understood this viscerally. Their art, their literature, their philosophy, all saturated with awareness of death's presence. Memento mori. Remember, you will die, not to induce despair, but to focus attention on what matters, on how we live, on what we leave behind. Modern life often denies death. We hide it, medicalize it, ignore it, until pandemic forces us to confront it. Bodies in refrigerated trucks, overwhelmed crematoria, mass graves, death made visible. unavoidable. It's traumatic, but also clarifying. What matters when faced with mortality? Not wealth, not status, not achievements, connection, love, kindness, meaning. The plague generation knew this. They created art celebrating human experience, human love, human life, not despite death. Because of it, knowing life is finite makes it precious. Knowing death is certain makes how we live important. This is the Black Death's final lesson. Not about disease, not about history, but about being human. We're fragile, mortal, vulnerable to invisible threats, but we're also resilient, creative, capable of extraordinary courage. We endure the worst and somehow find ways forward. We build, we create, we hope, even knowing it's temporary, even knowing death waits. That's the human story. The Black Death couldn't end it. No pandemic can, because we're more than bodies vulnerable to bacteria. We're consciousness, culture, connection, meaning, and those endure. The people of 1348 are gone, their names mostly forgotten, but their legacy remains. The art they created, the institutions they built, the changes they set in motion. They shaped the world we live in, just as we're shaping the world our descendants will inherit. What will we leave them? A world better prepared for pandemic, or more vulnerable? A world more equitable, or more divided? A world that learned from catastrophe, or repeated old mistakes? That's our choice, our responsibility. The Black Death is history, but its lessons are present. Pandemics will return. They always do. We can't prevent that, but we can prepare. We can build resilience, foster cooperation, value science, support each other. We can remember that we're all vulnerable, all mortal, and that our shared vulnerability should unite us, not divide us. That's what the empty village street of 1348 teaches. That in the face of invisible threats, we need each other. That survival requires solidarity. That human flourishing depends on collective care. The plague killed millions, but it couldn't kill humanity's capacity for compassion, for creativity, for hope. That survived, and it survives still. In every healthcare worker who risks exposure to help others. In every scientist pursuing knowledge to save lives. In every person who masks, vaccinates, isolates to protect their community. In acts of kindness amid crisis. That's who we are. At our best, vulnerable, yes. Mortal, yes. But also courageous, resilient, unbroken. The Black Death's victims are long gone, but we remember them. We honor them by learning, by preparing, by caring, by building a world that values every life. Not just the wealthy, not just the powerful, everyone. Because plague taught us death makes everyone equal. In the mass graves, nobility and poverty were indistinguishable. Kings and peasants, priests and beggars, all the same. That's a humbling truth, and a liberating one. If death makes us equal, life should too. Equal access to healthcare, to safety, to dignity. That's the world worth building. The world the plague generation couldn't build, but we can. With knowledge they lacked, tools they couldn't imagine, and the lessons their suffering taught us. So as you drift towards sleep, hold this thought. Life is fragile, but precious. Humanity is vulnerable, but resilient. Catastrophes happen, but we endure. We've survived the worst. We'll survive what comes next. Not unscathed, but alive. Together, human. That's the promise, the hope, the truth. From the silent streets of 1348 to the uncertain present. From the Black Death to whatever comes next. We endure. We remember. We carry on. Rest now. Let the weight of history settle. Let the lessons sink in. And tomorrow we'll keep building a world that remembers, that prepares, that cares, in memory of the millions lost, in hope for the millions yet to come. We endure